Ethan Parker had always been a man of solitude. He lived at the far end of Maplewood, Ohio, in a house that bordered a dense, shadowy forest. While the rest of the neighborhood thrived on barbecues, holiday decorations, and gossip-filled afternoon gatherings, Ethan preferred the quiet comfort of his home. He rarely spoke to anyone, only nodding politely if he happened to cross paths with a neighbor. His life was simple, structured, and most importantly, private. But that very privacy was exactly why people didn't trust him. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like Sadice, share, and subscribe so you won't miss out on more thrilling stories. Drop a comment below with your thoughts and share this story with those who need to hear it. Turn on the notification bell to stay updated with our latest videos. See you in the next exciting and meaningful story. Among them was Martha Reynolds, a widowed woman in her late 60s who had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years. While others ignored Ethan's reclusive nature, Martha saw it as a sign of something darker. She was the type to watch from behind her curtains, noticing details that no one else did. And to her, Ethan Parker was a mystery waiting to be unraveled. There were strange things about his house, things that gave Martha a deep, nagging sense of unease. For one, his lights flickered at odd hours, sometimes staying on well past midnight before suddenly shutting off all at once, as if someone, or something, was controlling them. There were nights when shadows moved behind his curtains, though Martha had never seen anyone else enter or leave his home. Even more unsettling was the sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from his attic, always at 3 a.m. The other neighbors brushed off Martha's concerns, dismissing them as the ramblings of an old woman with too much time on her hands. But she knew what she saw. And then there was that night. A month before everything unraveled, Martha had woken up feeling uneasy, as if something was watching her. Getting out of bed, she peeked outside her bedroom window, and her blood ran cold. Ethan was standing in his yard, completely still, his phone's screen casting an eerie glow on his face. His fingers moved rapidly, tapping away at something. But what terrified Martha the most was that he wasn't alone. A dark figure stood just a few feet behind him, barely visible in the dim light. The shape was tall, unnaturally thin, and unmoving. Martha's breath caught in her throat. Ethan didn't seem to notice it at all. She wanted to scream, to call the police, but just as she reached for her phone, the figure disappeared. Not by walking away, but simply fading into the darkness. The next morning, Martha had almost convinced herself that it had been a trick of the light. Almost. But then, Ethan started acting even stranger. His internet activity seemed erratic. He was often seen standing outside his house, phone in hand, furiously typing. And late at night, the flickering lights were accompanied by low whispers, carried on the wind. By the time Martha saw him standing outside one evening, staring at his phone like a man possessed, she had had enough. This wasn't just a strange neighbor with bad social skills. This was something more, something dangerous. With trembling fingers, she picked up the phone and dialed 911. What she didn't know was that she had just triggered the beginning of a nightmare far worse than she could ever imagine. Ethan Parker had always been cautious. Living alone on the edge of Maplewood, Ohio, he knew better than to take his security lightly. His doors were always locked, his cameras always on, and his passwords changed regularly. But tonight, something felt off. His Wi-Fi had been lagging for weeks, slow at odd hours, buffering when it never used to. At first, he chalked it up to bad service, but then the paranoia set in. What if someone else was using his network? Sitting at his desk, he opened his router settings, scrolling through the list of connected devices. His phone, his laptop, his smart TV, all accounted for. But then he saw it. A device named The Watcher. His breath hitched. He had never seen that name before. It wasn't a factory-labeled device like a printer or a smart speaker. No, this had been named deliberately. And worse? It had been connected for over 3 months. His hand hovered over the disconnect button. His gut screamed at him to shut it down immediately, but his curiosity held him back. Who was the Watcher? Clicking into the logs, his stomach twisted. The device hadn't just been stealing Wi-Fi, It had been accessing his home security cameras. Every single one. His hands turned clammy as he scrolled through the access history. The logs showed someone had been viewing live feeds from his cameras, his front door, his backyard, and worse, his bedroom. But Ethan had never installed a camera in his bedroom. A shiver ran down his spine. His head snapped toward his bedroom door, heart hammering. He had lived alone for years. No guests, no roommates, no reason for a hidden camera to exist. Unless someone had put it there. With shaking hands, he pulled up the footage. The screen flickered before showing a grainy black and white night vision feed of his own room. The camera was angled toward his bed. He could see himself, tangled in blankets, fast asleep. His throat tightened. The recording was from last night. The timestamp read 3:13 a.m. His finger hovered over the fast-forward button, his pulse pounding. Who installed this camera? When? How? He pressed play. At first, nothing happened, just the steady rise and fall of his breathing. Then, at 3:14 a.m., something shifted. The closet door moved. Just a fraction of an inch, but enough. Ethan's stomach twisted into knots. He stared, unblinking, as the door continued to inch open, revealing only darkness beyond it. Then, the feed cut to static. Ethan jerked backward in his chair, his breath ragged. He spun toward his closet door. Closed. Just like always. Or so he thought. With every ounce of courage he could summon, he grabbed the nearest object, a screwdriver, and crept toward the door. The floor creaked beneath him. A whisper of cold air brushed past his skin. His fingers trembled as he grabbed the handle and, in one swift motion, yanked the door open. Nothing. Just clothes, shoes, and boxes. But as his eyes scanned the back wall, he saw it. A small red light blinking from the darkness. His breath caught. Reaching in, he pulled out a tiny wireless camera, its lens pointed directly at his bed. And taped beneath it, a piece of paper. Scrawled in uneven, frantic handwriting were 4 words. You changed the password. Ethan stumbled back, his entire body going cold. Someone had been inside his house. Someone had been watching. And they knew what he had just done. Ethan's hands trembled as he stared at the note taped beneath the tiny blinking camera. You changed the password. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out everything else. Someone had been inside his house. Someone had watched him for months. And now, they knew he was onto them. His first instinct was to run, to grab his keys, get in his car, and drive as far away as possible. But then a darker thought settled in. What if they were still here? Ethan's head snapped toward the closet, his breathing ragged. His mind played tricks on him. Was the door closer than before? Had it creaked just a second ago? The air felt heavy, thick with something unseen. He took a shaky step back, his phone still clenched in his sweaty palm. That's when the lights in his house flickered. Once, twice, then complete darkness. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. His breath came in shallow gasps. He reached for the nearest object, a metal flashlight on his desk, his only weapon. And then, a loud knock shattered the silence. He nearly dropped the flashlight. The sound had come from the front door. Someone was there, watching, waiting. His phone buzzed violently in his hand, and he almost screamed. An unknown number. Every fiber of his being told him not to answer, but his fingers moved on their own. Slowly, he raised the phone to his ear. Silence. Then, a voice. Distorted. Hollow. You shouldn't have done that, Ethan. His stomach dropped. He slammed the call off and backed away from the door, his breath coming out in short, panicked bursts. Whoever this was, they weren't just watching him. They were playing with him. And that's when he saw it. Movement at the window. A shadowy figure, barely visible in the dim streetlight. It stood perfectly still, just beyond the glass. Not moving, not blinking. Watching. Ethan's entire body went rigid. He wasn't alone. The pounding on the door came again, this time more urgent. "Ethan Parker, this is the police!" His knees nearly buckled. Police? Had someone called them? He stumbled toward the door, hands still shaking as he undid the locks. As soon as it swung open, two officers stood on his porch, flashlights cutting through the darkness. One was tall and broad-shouldered, his hand near his holster. The other, a woman with a sharp gaze, studied him carefully. "Sir, we got a call about suspicious activity at this residence. Can you explain what's going on?" Ethan tried to form words, but his throat was dry. He glanced back at the window. The figure was gone. The female officer, Mitchell, narrowed her eyes. "You look like you just saw a ghost." Ethan let out a shaky breath. "I think someone's been in my house," he whispered. Officer Collins, the taller one, stiffened. "Can you clarify, sir?" Ethan slowly lifted his phone, showing them the note. Mitchell took one look at it, and her face paled. "We need to come inside. Now." Ethan stepped back, his mind racing. Who had called the cops? And more importantly, had they just walked into a trap? Ethan stepped aside, letting Officers Collins and Mitchell into his home. The second they crossed the threshold, a wave of unease settled over the room. The air felt heavier, thick with something unseen, something wrong. Mitchell's flashlight cut through the dimness, scanning the walls, the floor, the furniture. Everything looked normal, too normal, like nothing had ever happened. But Ethan knew better. "Start from the beginning," Collins said, his voice calm but firm. "You said someone was in your house?" Ethan took a deep breath, trying to steady his thoughts. "Not just someone," he muttered. "They've been here for months, watching me." Collins exchanged a glance with Mitchell, who remained focused, her eyes darting to every dark corner of the house. She felt it too. Ethan pulled out his phone, his fingers still trembling as he brought up his Wi-Fi logs. "Here," he said, showing them the name, The Watcher. Mitchell frowned, stepping closer. "You recognize this device?" she asked. Ethan shook his head. "It's been connected to my network for months, but I never noticed until today. And then I found—" He hesitated, glancing toward his bedroom. His stomach twisted. "Found what?" Collins pressed. Ethan swallowed hard. "A hidden camera. In my bedroom." The air in the room shifted. Something cold settled in the pit of his stomach. Mitchell's expression darkened. "Where?" He led them toward the bedroom, the floor creaking underfoot. The moment they stepped inside, Mitchell's flashlight landed on the open closet door. The space inside looked empty, except for the faint, blinking red light. Collins stepped forward, crouching down. With gloved hands, he peeled the tiny device off the wall, his face unreadable. "This is sophisticated," he murmured. "Not some cheap surveillance cam. This was meant to be hidden." Ethan exhaled sharply. "There's more," he said, pulling out the note that had been taped beneath it. "You changed the password." Mitchell's jaw clenched. "Who the hell left this?" Collins muttered. "I don't know," Ethan admitted. "But someone has been watching me. Someone who got into my house without me knowing." Mitchell took a step back, scanning the room with renewed intensity. "You said this device accessed your security cameras?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "Then that means they weren't just watching you, Parker," Collins said, his voice low. Mitchell tapped on her radio. "Dispatch, we need cybercrime support at this residence ASAP," she said, her tone clipped. Ethan's skin crawled. "Wait, what do you mean? Who else have they been watching?" Mitchell turned to him, her face pale but serious. "If someone hacked your network, they could have done the same to others. And if they left a note—" She glanced back at the blinking camera, then at the closet, her eyes darkening. "They aren't done with you yet." Ethan stood frozen as Officer Mitchell's words sank in. "They aren't done with you yet." A shiver ran down his spine. Someone had been inside his home, leaving hidden cameras, monitoring his every move. But if what the officers were saying was true, he wasn't the only one. "We need to check your security logs," Collins said, motioning toward Ethan's laptop. Ethan nodded stiffly and led them back to his desk. His fingers trembled as he opened his network activity history. The screen flickered before loading a long list of access logs, far longer than it should have been. Mitchell leaned in. "These IP addresses," she murmured, pointing to the screen. Ethan's heart pounded as he recognized the pattern. These weren't just random intrusions. There were multiple sources, dozens of connections pinging from different locations within the neighborhood. His stomach twisted. Whoever did this, Ethan swallowed. They weren't just watching me, they were watching everyone. Colin's face darkened as he traced the source of the transmissions. One address stood out. A strong signal, constantly active, like a central hub. The data wasn't being sent somewhere far away. It was coming from within the neighborhood. Mitchell's eyes narrowed. "Can you pinpoint exactly where?" Ethan's fingers flew over the keyboard, his breathing uneven. The results loaded in seconds, and then his blood ran cold. No, that can't be right," he whispered. Mitchell and Collins leaned over, following his gaze. The address on the screen belonged to a house just a few doors down. A house that Ethan knew. A house that belonged to Ryan Reynolds, the 23-year-old nephew of Martha Reynolds. Ethan turned slowly toward the officers, his mouth dry. "It's coming from Ryan's house." A silence heavier than before settled in the room. Collins clenched his jaw. "Are you sure?" Ethan nodded. "Every transmission, every breach, it all links back to his network." Mitchell turned toward the window, staring into the darkened street. The house in question sat only 5 doors down, its windows dark, its driveway empty. But something about it felt wrong. Martha's voice suddenly echoed in Ethan's mind. "That boy barely leaves his room, always on his computer typing away." The pieces clicked into place, and a sick realization dawned on Ethan. "He's been in his house this whole time," he whispered. "Watching us. Controlling everything from there." Mitchell reached for her radio. "Dispatch, we have a possible suspect linked to multiple surveillance breaches. Requesting backup at..." The power cut out. The entire house plunged into pitch-black darkness. Ethan's breath hitched. A second later, the front door creaked open. Not from the outside. From within the house. Mitchell drew her weapon instantly, Collins's flashlight flickering on. The beam cut through the darkness, sweeping the living room. Empty. "Ethan," Collins whispered, "are you sure you were alone tonight?" Ethan's throat went dry. I thought I was." A soft, rhythmic tapping started from somewhere upstairs. 3 slow knocks, then silence. Mitchell's hand tightened on her gun. "I don't think Ryan's watching from his house anymore." A chill crawled up Ethan's spine. Because suddenly, he wasn't sure if he was still alone. The house was silent, except for the sound of Ethan's own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The power was out. The front door had creaked open on its own. And now, upstairs, 3 slow knocks echoed from the darkness. Officer Collins and Mitchell moved immediately, their flashlights cutting through the shadows. Collins positioned himself near the staircase, weapon drawn, while Mitchell scanned the hallway leading toward the back of the house. Ethan stood frozen in place, gripping the edge of his desk, his breath shallow. He had locked every door. He had been alone. Hadn't he? "We need to clear the house," Mitchell whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Collins gave a tight nod. "Mr. Parker, stay here." Ethan wanted to argue. This was his house, his nightmare unfolding in real time, but his legs refused to move. Mitchell took the lead, her flashlight aimed at the staircase. Every step creaked under her boots, the kind of sound that made Ethan's stomach twist. It was the sound of something old, something not meant to be disturbed. Collins followed, his body tense, gun raised. Ethan watched them disappear up the stairs, their lights bobbing in the darkness. He listened, straining his ears for any sign of movement. Then, a rustling sound. Not from upstairs, from behind him. His stomach lurched. Slowly, he turned. The closet door was open again. But this time, it wasn't empty. A black screen flickered to life inside, illuminating the small space with a dim, eerie glow. Ethan's breath caught as rows of distorted video feeds appeared. Grainy security footage from inside his house, his bedroom, his kitchen, his living room, right where he stood. His hands shook as he stepped forward, staring at the feeds. One of them showed Collins and Mitchell, slowly moving down the upstairs hallway. Another showed the front door, slightly ajar, the outside world just beyond its threshold. And then, his eyes landed on the last feed. His office. The very room he was standing in. His blood ran ice cold, because there, on the screen, was himself, standing exactly where he was, staring at the monitor. But in the reflection behind him, just out of frame, someone else was standing there, right behind him. Ethan whirled around, swinging the flashlight like a weapon. But there was no one there. His breathing was ragged, his vision blurred with panic. His mind screamed at him to run, to leave, to do anything but stand here. But then, his phone vibrated in his pocket. The screen lit up. Unknown caller. His shaking thumb hovered over the screen. He didn't want to answer. He knew he shouldn't. But he did. He raised the phone to his ear. For a moment, silence. Then, a whisper. "You should have stayed offline, Ethan." The call ended, and the screen of the closet monitor flickered to black. Ethan's hands were slick with sweat as he lowered the phone. His pulse thundered in his ears. The voice, that whisper, still lingered in his mind like an echo from something not entirely human. Mira feed was shaky, moving slightly, as if someone was holding the camera and filming in real time. And then, the camera tilted upward. Ethan's blood ran cold. Standing in the middle of Martha's living room was Ryan Reynolds. The glow of multiple computer monitors cast eerie shadows across his face. His expression was blank, empty, but his eyes were locked onto the camera. Locked onto Ethan. And then, Ryan grinned. The screen glitched. The feed cut to static. Ethan stumbled backward, his pulse hammering. No. Ryan was watching him. But how? The address. The Wi-Fi. The hacked cameras. Ryan wasn't just some amateur hacker playing around. He had built an entire system to spy on the entire neighborhood. Mitchell's voice crackled through the radio upstairs. "Dispatch. We have confirmation of a cyber breach linked to a suspect at 194 Pineview Drive. Request immediate units on site." 194 Pineview Drive. Ryan's house. Ethan's body went rigid. They had to stop him. Now. But before he could move, his phone vibrated again. A new text message from an unknown number. 4 simple words. "You're too late, Ethan." Ethan's breath came in short, ragged bursts as he stared at the message on his phone. "You're too late, Ethan." His fingers tightened around the device, his body going rigid with fear. Too late for what? Upstairs, Mitchell and Collins were still moving through the house, their voices crackling through the radio. But they didn't know. They didn't see what he had just seen. Ryan had been watching them. Ryan had been waiting. And now, Ryan had made his move. Ethan shoved his phone into his pocket and bolted toward the stairs. "Mitchell, Collins!" His voice came out sharp, panicked. "He's at Martha's house." "Ryan's there. He knows we're onto him." Collins appeared at the top of the staircase, eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" "The camera feed. It was live. He's inside her house right now. We have to go." A loud crash split the air, shaking the very walls of the house. The officers reacted instantly, weapons drawn. "Stay here, Parker," Mitchell barked as she and Collins rushed past him, out the door toward Martha's house. Ethan hesitated for only a second before his feet moved on their own, following them into the cold night. Martha's house sat dark, still, except for the faint glow of her living room window. But something felt off. The air itself seemed heavier. Mitchell and Collins reached the front door first. It was unlocked, swinging open slightly, as if inviting them inside. Ethan's gut twisted. "Martha?" Collins called, stepping inside with his gun raised. Silence. Then, a whisper. Low, impossible to trace. "You shouldn't have come." The house plunged into darkness. A single sound followed, a slow, deliberate tap. Once, twice, then nothing. Ethan's blood turned to ice. Ryan had planned this. Mitchell's voice cut through the eerie silence. Collins, move! Secure the rooms. But before she could finish, a screen flickered to life inside the house. A monitor, placed deliberately in the center of the living room. And on it, live footage of Ethan, standing right where he was. Ethan's breath hitched. How? And then the camera angle shifted. Not to him. Not to Martha. But to Mitchell and Collins. Ryan was watching them too. And now, he was about to make his next move.